Now, if this were King David or something doing that, or, the Apostle John or something to his daughter, well, maybe we'd look at that a little more and think, now, maybe there's some symbolism in here that we should understand. David's not going to murder his own son, or John's not going to murder his own son. Now, if we had this much material, we'd still have to go with what the text said. But what I'm saying is that if it came during another time in Israel's history, then perhaps we would consider the alternative that maybe he didn't offer her up physically or literally in death, but only symbolically by surrendering her to the service of the Lord. But you've got to remember, we're right smack dab in the middle of the book of Judges. And we're right in the middle of the period of the Judges here, where you've got all types of barbarous Canaanite pagan practices taking place here. Chapter 12 goes on to show us that they're killing 42,000 Ephraimites. And when we get to the end in chapters 20 and 21, and you've got the civil war with Benjamin, they're killing 25,000 of Benjamites there. The rest of the children of Israel are killing 25,000 Benjamites. So they're just one hand on the other, murdering each other at this time. So since it's during this period of the Judges, where every man did that which was right in his own eyes, then to Jephthah, this was a rash vow he made. We see the Canaanite influence that he's had. We see that he lives on the wrong side of Jordan. We see that he's been brought up by a harlot for a mother. We see all these other things that point against him. And it only takes a little leaven to leaven the whole lump here. And when he's been influenced the way he has, and he utters this rash vow, then he's going to go on and fulfill it. Now go back and read. I want to read verse 31 again and verse 39. Then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the children of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's. Now, if that's all we had, we could assume something else besides murder. And I will offer it up for an olah, for a burnt offering. Now, that's what Jephthah said. Now, what the critics want to say about what Jephthah said is beside the point. Remember, this is the word of God, and Jephthah just said, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now, you're getting in a dangerous place when you want to say, but he didn't offer it up for a burnt offering, when he said that he was going to, and then when God's own commentary in verse 39 says, and it came to pass at the end of 2 months that she returned unto her father, who did, look at verse 39, who did with her according to his vow which he had vowed. Now the Bible tells us that he did do what he vowed to do. What did he vow to do? Verse 31, offer her up for an olah. What did he do? Verse 39, the commentary on that, he did according to his vow. Which means that he did offer her for a burnt offering. Strapped her on the altar and burn her alive, in other words. Now I could wish that it was the other way. But it's characteristic of this period that this is indeed what took place. Do we have any questions on that? We should have covered that well enough so that there shouldn't be any. That this is what happened. And like I said, you find them split down the middle. I know that several of the conservative scholars want to say that this didn't happen, and several of them want to say that it did happen, that he actually did sacrifice her here. Most of them, by the way, are basing their beliefs on Keel and Delitzsch's Old Testament commentaries, which are some of the best Old Testament commentaries around. But there's more than one thing that Keel and Delitzsch had to say that unscriptural in their commentaries, though. That's an excellent set of commentaries written by these two German scholars last century, or over 100 years ago, and they're still in print today. They're an excellent set of commentaries. And they go to much detail, Keel goes to much detail in explaining that she was really surrendered to service at the tabernacle. And this, I believe, is where a lot of them have picked this notion up, that this wasn't a literal fulfillment of this. One more thing, by the way, before we get off this subject, the position all the way up until the Middle Ages was that this was a literal human sacrifice here. The church never questioned that. The early theologians never questioned the fact that this was a literal burnt offering up until the time of the Middle Ages. Since that time, then we've got some changes there. We always want to go back and see what the early church fathers had to say. They're not always right, but we want to go back and see what, if there existed a consensus on these critical questions. And if there did exist a consensus on things like this, then it's generally safe to trust what they had to say. Now, when it gets to the area of the miraculous, then you might have to question some of that, because they'll tell you that, tongues are no longer for today and healing's not for today. Well, we'd expect people to say things like that. Anyway, let's go on to chapter 12. In chapter 12, we've got the end of Jephthah's life and 3 more judges tacked on. Now, the Ephraimites are quite upset with Jephthah because they didn't get to get in on some of the glory that he had for his great conquest of their enemies. And as a result, we've got a little war here between Jephthah and his followers of Gileadites and among the Ephraimites. Down in verse 5, the Gileadites took the passages of Jordan before the Ephraimites, and it was so that when those Ephraimites which were escaped said, "Let me go over," that the men of Gilead said unto him, "Art thou an Ephraimite?" And if he said no or nay, then said they unto him, "Say now Shibboleth." And he said Sibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it right. Then they took him and slew him at the passages of Jordan, and there fell at that time of the Ephraimites 42,000. Jephthah judged Israel 6 years, then died Jephthah the Gileadite, and was buried in one of the cities of Gilead. So you see that there's been a long enough separation between some of the tribes on the east and some of the tribes on the western part or side of the Jordan River, so that we have a minor change already in dialect. This isn't to be surprising. Remember over in the account of Peter, whenever he is watching slyly, he's sneaking to watch and see what happens to Jesus there at the very end, and finally someone says, "I can tell he is the Galilean because thy speech bewrayeth thee." In other words, your dialect, your old Galilean speech gives you away, and I know you're a Galilean, and you must have followed this man from Galilee, Nazareth of Galilee. We've got the same thing today, right here in our country. We've just been here several hundred years, not as long as this period, 300 years where they've been divided, just several hundred years. And what is the distinction between people in the north and the south and people in the east and the west? We're all Americans, but we all talk differently, though. We've been separated from each other long enough, we end up with a different dialect. We pronounce words entirely differently. So here we have an account where they just couldn't get that SH sound. Now, you think you can pronounce everything, but you just try studying a foreign language who actually has a sound in their language that you've never used before, and it's hard to pronounce that word. You can pronounce an A, E, I, O, and U. We have those sounds. I can't even think of one off the top of my head, but you put a couple of letters together that we don't put together in our language, and you get this strange sound, and sometimes it's hard to pronounce. So they said Sibboleth, and they couldn't frame to pronounce the word Shibboleth, and it cost 42,000 of them their lives. Verse 8, we have another judge, Ibzan, who was from Bethlehem. Now, there were 2 Bethlehems in Israel. There was one in Judah and one in Zebulun. Probably he was from Zebulun. Later on in the book, we'll come across Bethlehem again, and since it's Bethlehem, Judah, they mention it, Bethlehem, Judah. But here they just mention Bethlehem, so we don't know, but perhaps this is Bethlehem, Zebulun. So that would put us up in northern Israel rather than in southern Israel. Verse 11, we have Elon. He happens to also be from Zebulun. He's a Zebulunite. Verse 13, we have another judge, Abdon, the son of Hillel, a Pirathonite. Pirathon was evidently a city in Ephraim, because verse 15 talks about him being buried in Ephraim. So he was an Ephraimite, would put him from the middle part, the middle section of Israel. We've got these 3 men tacked on because they had probably a short period, and let's see, how long did they have? The first one had 7, the next one had 10, the next one had 8 years, and they probably didn't do a lot in their life. Now we come to our other important judge that we're going to look at this evening, and that takes us chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16. So 13 through 16 all deal with Samson. Now, he's so well known from Sunday school that I trust you know the account here. Chapter 13 is Samson's birth. Chapter 14 is his riddle and the consequence of his riddle that he puts forth. Now, there's some language there in the end of chapter 14 you just don't want to be caught reading here in feminist America. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you read about his riddle. And there's some language at the end. Don't read it now because you'll miss what I'm fixing to say. Chapter 15, you can read it when you get home. Chapter 15, we've got his great fight on the rock Etam. We've also got his catching here 300 jackals. It's called foxes in the AV, but they're jackals because jackals ran around in packs together, and he evidently caught several packs of the animals together. It's been much more difficult to catch these solitary fox and find 300 of them. That's down in verse 4, where you got your word foxes. It should be jackals. One other thing we could change is in verse 19. They didn't quite know what to do. Did the water that he drank, did it come out of the jawbone, or did it come out of the rock there? Well, they gave us the jaw in verse 19, but it came out of Lehi, which is what you have in your margin. It came out of the rock where he was fighting there at Etam. 15:19, God clave a hollow place that was in the jaw. No, it was in Lehi. And water came out, and he drank, and his spirit came again, and he revived. Now, that doesn't mean his spirit had departed from his body. It just means that he was refreshed. Hebrew way of saying he was refreshed. Then in chapter 16, we have the scandalous woman Delilah, Samson's capture, Samson's death. He also is included over in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, I believe, with people that had faith. And he ended up killing more in his death than he killed in his life, of course, by pushing the great pillars down where you got 3,000 lords and ladies of the Philistines making sport over him. Now, do you remember what chapters 17 through 21 are about? Someone remember? Now, these are going to be different from everything else that we've looked at, the first 16 chapters. Why is that the case? Because chapters 17 through 21 go back at the very beginning. They should be placed back at the very beginning of Judges chronologically, and these are two historical appendices that are attached to the book. We've got two of them. Chapters 17 and 18, we have one event. And chapters 19 through 21, we have another event. The first event, 17 and 18, is the migration of the Danites. Then 19 to 21, we have the civil war fought between Israel and Benjamin. That's right, Israel had a civil war just like we did. A costly one here. It almost cost them a 12th of their people, that is, one whole tribe. Now, these have been placed in here to show us, again, a little something about what this period is really like. So we're going to look at several things in both of these accounts. But these should go back, we can prove internally from these accounts, we will when we get there. These should be placed all the way back at the very beginning of the book of Judges chronologically. Now, 17 and 18 deal with this man named Micah and the Levite priest that he hires and the migration of the Danites. Let's start in 17 in verse 1. We're not going to read all these verses, these chapters, but we want to just kind of sum up what's going on here, because we've got some interesting things here. Anyone know ahead of time who this Levite is in chapter 17? Anyone know who he is? His name's not given. Well, we'll tell you then when we get there. He's interesting. You'll want to know who this Levite is. And there's one reason, because of who this Levite is, that's why he's giving us this story. You'll see when we get there. There was a man of Mount Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, now she's been saving up some money here. This is what's going to take place. She's been saving up some money, and he stole it from her. And she's real upset about that, and anyway, he decides to give her back the money, and she tells him, I was saving it partly for you anyway so that I can make you a molten image. Okay, verse 2, and he said to his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from thee, about which thou cursest, so she put a curse on whoever took it, didn't know it was her son, and spakest of also in mine ears, behold, the silver is with me, I took it. And his mother said, blessed be thou of the Lord, my son. And when he had restored the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver unto the Lord from my hand for my son to make a graven image and a molten image. Now therefore I will restore it unto thee. Now you see, this is how mixed up they are in this period. She said, I've wholly dedicated them to Yahweh, to the Lord. For what purpose? So that I can make a graven image. That's just how far they've slid backwards there. And she doesn't see anything wrong with that, in other words. She's serving the Lord as she thinks that she should be. Yet he restored the money unto his mother, and his mother took 200 shekels of silver, gave them to the founder, who made thereof a graven image and a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a house of gods, and made an ephod and teraphim, and consecrated one of his sons, who became his priest. So he's still in contact with his old mother, but he's grown up and has children himself. Verse 6, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So Micah, has set up his own little pagan sanctuary here with his own little idols and ephods and teraphim and all types of little gods that he's set up here, that he's going to worship all in the name of Yahweh and his Israelite religion. Verse 7 introduces us with the Levite. There was a young man out of Bethlehem, Judah. So this is the Bethlehem in Judah. Of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he sojourned there. The man departed out of the city of Bethlehem, Judah, to sojourn where he could find a place. And he came to Mount Ephraim, to the house of Micah, as he journeyed. Micah said unto him, Whence comest thou? And he said unto him, I am a Levite of Bethlehem, Judah, and I go to sojourn where I may find a place. Now, Levites aren't supposed to do that. They're supposed to stay in the Levitical cities that God has given them. So he's sinning already himself now. And Micah said unto him, Dwell with me, and be unto me a father and a priest, and I will give thee 10 shekels of silver by the year, and a suit of apparel, and thy victuals. So the Levite went in. The Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man was unto him as one of his sons, the young Levite. And Micah consecrated the Levite. The young man became his priest, and was in the house of Micah. Then said Micah, Now know I that the Lord will do me good, seeing I have a Levite to my priest. Now before this, in verse 5, he had just had a make-do priest. That was his own son that he had made priest there. But now he thinks that God's really going to be pleased with him because he actually has a Levite. And this is their superstition coming forth, where he thinks that God's blessing is dependent on whether or not he's got a Levite there staying with him. Now in chapter 18 is where we are introduced right away to the migration of the Danites that we'll show you again on our transparencies on the screen. To show you what's taking place here. And this is the history of the Danites moving, by which we end up later on in Israel with the phrase from Dan to Beersheba, which is simply saying from the north to the south. But you see, Dan starts off right over here on the coast. But because he doesn't have enough room, he sends out, the tribe of Dan sends out a group of spies here, and they send them up north. And here you're going to see Dan, a city of Dan, and the region called Dan, where these people are going to live later on. Another group of them up here. And this is their second place where they live. Now in verse 3, chapter 18. See, they've sent out this large company of spies to go spy out the land. And they're going to go up to this particular place and find a city called Laish or Lesham, which they're going to rename Dan. And they say that the people are quiet and secure. There's no guards. They don't live close enough to anyone. The Zidonians are a long way off. They don't live close enough to anyone to call on help whenever we begin to take them. And they're going to report back to the camp down here at Dan, say that's a good place for us to live. The ground is fertile. The people are secure. No guards. There won't be much of a fight. And they're going to go up and take that region. But as they're going to pass by the house of Micah and this Levite. And of course, whenever they go past the house of Micah and this Levite, they're going to want to take all of Micah's gods and this Levite along with them. They have the same superstition that that's going to be a blessing to them in the long run. But verse 3 is very interesting. When they were by the house of Micah, they knew the voice of the young man, the Levite. Now, how did they know his voice? They means all 600 of these men in this spy mission here. They happen to be from Dan. He happens to be from Bethlehem, Judah. Now, how can you explain the fact that all of these men know the voice of this Levite unless he's a very important Levite? Well, he is an important one. Verse 7. Well, let's see. We need to go on down later that. Verse 18. These spies here, well, I think they're going to have to come back with their other group of men to actually take the city. Just a handful of spies go out at the very beginning. And then when the actual group of 600 go out, they're the ones who are going to take the city. But here in verse 18, now these went into Micah's house and fetched the carved image, the ephah, the teraphim, and the molten image. Then said the priest unto them, What do ye? And they said unto him, Hold thy peace, lay thine hand upon thy mouth, and go with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Just what Micah had said. Is it better for thee to be a priest unto the house of one man, or that thou be a priest unto a tribe and a family in Israel? And the priest's heart was glad. So he'd much rather be the priest of a whole tribe of people here than just this one man, this one man's family, this one man's household here. So as the story goes, the priest does decide to follow them. Micah and the people that live around him decide to come out and go after the children of Dan, chase after them, and tell them, what are you doing, taking away those things that belong to us? And the children of Dan say, unless you can fight us and beat us, you better go back home. So they know that they can't beat them, so they all go back home. Then we come to verse 27. And they took the things which Micah had made, and the priests which he had, and came unto Laish, it's also called Lesham, and they renamed the city Dan, unto a people that were at quiet and secure, and they smote them with the edge of the sword, and burnt the city with fire. Now this is way up north here that they're taking. This is what's referred to here in verse 27. There was no deliverer because it was far from Zidon. And they had no business with any man. And it was in the valley that lieth by Beth-rehob. They built a city and dwelt therein. And they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan their father, who was born unto Israel. Howbeit the name of the city was Laish at the first. And the children of Dan set up the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan, until the day of the captivity of the land. And they set them up Micah's graven image, which he made, all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. Now the house of God is going to still be down here at Shiloh, which would be in this region here. And this is where true worship should be taking place. But instead they set up a rival religion up north, which is exactly what follows after Solomon and the division of the kingdom. That Jeroboam, who becomes king in Israel, sets up his rival centers of worship, one up at Dan and one at Bethel, where he's going to set up his golden calves. Well, who's the Levite then? Did you see it in verse 30? Jonathan. Who's Jonathan? Who's he the son of? Gershom. Who's he the grandson of? Who? What did you say? Moses? Moses, right. He's the grandson of Moses here. Now you say, well, how in the world did Manasseh get in there? Well, let me see if I can show you. Do I have a piece of paper up here? I'll show you how it got in there. A scribe put this in. Of course, the scribes, the Jewish scribes, the Masoretes, they don't like this reflection that it casts on their great lawgiver Moses to find out his grandson becomes this idolatrous priest here. So all they got to do is change one consonant. Instead of Moses, we end up with Manasseh. This is in the field of Old Testament textual criticism, which we'll be teaching here next of all. We'll get into the history of textual criticism and the canon and the text of the Older and Newer Testaments, where we'll explain some things like this. But you shouldn't have Manasseh there in your Bible. Now this is what the Masoretes wanted to put in here. This is what we've got in the original MSH, which is what you get the word Manasseh from, the name Manasseh. And some scribe inserted an N, or this is what we get Moses from. This is what we get Moses from. Then some scribe inserted an N up here at the top, and pretty soon that got incorporated into the text, and that's where we get our word Manasseh from. Now, I told you that backwards when I started, so make sure you understand. This is what we get Moses from, M-S-H, M-O-S-E-S. And so some scribe writes an N, and later on it's adopted into the text, and we end up with Manasseh. Because remember, one of the names of Moses' son was Gershom. Moses had a son named Gershom. This is one of the things that proves to us that this account, 17 and 18, has to be back at the very beginning of the period of the Judges. We've got to get it back close to the time of Moses, or how could this be his grandson? It'd have to be his great-great-great-great-grandson. Because remember, we've gone through 300 years period of the Judges here. You'd go through many generations. But if we go back to the very beginning of the period of the Judges, which is when this took place, then we could very easily have a grandson of Moses still alive. That answers the question of 18 and 3. He had been a leader in Israel, evidently, before. Everyone knew the children and the grandchildren of Moses. That's how they all knew his voice. He had to have been some particular prominent person for these men to know his voice back in chapter 18 and verse 3, which is exactly the case. His name was Jonathan, his father was Gershom, and his grandfather wasn't Manasseh, but it was Moses. Very interesting. Now you see, friends, we've just got all types of things like that right here in your Bible that you're reading. And that's why we're going to teach another class later on to show you where those things are, so you won't be confused about some of these things, because you never would have known that should be Moses there instead of Manasseh. Only way you could have even gotten that is from the father of Jonathan, Gershom, and from chapter 18 and verse 3, and I don't hardly know anyone that ever even spots chapter 18 and verse 3. You'd have to think right away, he's got to be someone very important for everyone to know his voice like that. And if he's the son of Gershom, then you could put two and two together and think, well, maybe he should be Moses. But then you're not going to question the Word of God here that tells you Manasseh, though. No way you'd question that. But if you do a little study, which is something I like to do in textual criticism, then you can go back to some of your earlier manuscripts and you can see exactly how we got the King James, the Authorized Version, and all the other versions, and which ones are the best, and where are they not the best, and where are they the best, and things like this. Chapters 19 to 21 close out the book. We've got a long story here. I'll briefly recount that to you. We have another Levite here. Now this is a different man. We have another Levite here who has a concubine that he marries, and she plays the whore on him and ends up back at her father's house, and he goes to his father-in-law's house and tries to talk her into coming back to live with him. And he is successful after tarrying one day there with his father-in-law of getting the woman to go back with him. They are traveling along with his servant. The Levite has a servant and his concubine wife. She's a wife, in a sub-sense, a concubine wife. These three are traveling. It becomes rather late in the evening, and they have to find a place to stay. Now you see there in verse 10, they can't stay at Jebus, Jerusalem, because the Jebusites are still living there, which is going to put it way back in the early time of the period of the Judges. So they end up with, I think there are a couple of places, either Gibeah or Ramah. They can either go to Gibeah or Ramah. And they finally end up in Gibeah. Now we'll start reading in verse 22. Now these are the men at Gibeah. He and his concubine wife and his servant are all staying at an old man's house. The custom in that day was you don't check into a hotel or anything. You just go in and sit down in the middle of the street. And people are supposed to be friendly enough. They're not today. You'd get run over if you sat down in the street today. But back then, you're supposed to be hospitable enough that if you saw someone sitting in the street near dark, you'd assume they're a stranger and they probably don't have a place to stay. And you'd invite them into your home, which is exactly what this old man does for the Levite, his concubine, and his servant. Verse 22. Now as they, the old man, the concubine, the Levite, and his servant, were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, certain sons of Belial, sons of worthlessness, beset the house round about, and beat at the door, and spake to the master of the house, the old man, saying, Bring forth the man that came into thine house, that we may know him. Now this means sexual abuse here. And this is painting a portrayal and a picture of what the period of the Judges was like. We've got sodomites here. And the man, the master of the house, went out unto them, and he doesn't do much better. It says, Nay, my brethren, nay, I pray you, do not so wickedly, seeing that this man is come into mine house, do not this folly. Behold, here is my daughter, a maiden, and his concubine. Them I will bring out now, and humble ye them, and do with them that seemeth good unto you, but unto this man do not so vile a thing. Now see, you can always have levels of righteousness. He's righteous insofar as he realizes, now we can't have this sodomite practice going on here around us. But he says, I'll give you my daughter and his concubine. Well, that satisfies him. So he's just as bad. So, verse 25, the men would not hearken to him. So the man took his concubine and brought her forth unto them, and they knew her and abused her all the night until the morning. And when the day began to spring, they let her go. Then came the woman in the dawning of the day, and fell down at the door of the man's house where her Lord was, till it was light. And her Lord rose up in the morning, and opened the doors of the house, and went out to go his way. Behold, the woman, his concubine, was fallen down at the door of the house, and her hands were upon the threshold. He said unto her, Up, and let us be going. But none answered. Then the man took her up upon an ass, and the man rose up and gat him unto his place. And he doesn't do much better himself. When he was come into his house, he took a knife and laid hold on his concubine, and divided her together with her bones, must have been a sharp knife, into 12 pieces, and sent her into all the coast of Israel. And it was so that all that saw it said, There was no such deed done nor seen from the day that the children of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt unto this day. Consider of it, take advice, and speak your minds. So chapter 19 is the background to the civil war which takes place in chapter 20. All of Israel, I think 400,000 men are going to fight 26,700 men from Benjamin. Of course, Gibeah is a city in Benjamin. That's the point here. Gibeah is a city in Benjamin. And because the Benjamites won't give up those sons of Belial who lived there in Gibeah, then the rest of Israel says, then we'll just have to destroy all of you. They told them, if you'll deliver us the men that did this, we'll kill them and spare you. The Benjamites, see, they're so vile. The whole tribe here is so vile. They say, no, we'll just all fight you to protect these people in our city. So they fight, and I think that Israel loses the first two battles. Now remember, the odds are 400,000 to 26,700. And they lose. The 400,000 lose the first two battles. Finally, they do win and end up killing every single male in Benjamin with the exception of 600 men. These 600 were part of the 700 left-handed men who were sling throwers. They could throw stones from slings. So they end up with 600 men. In verse 47, Israel's defeated them. Then chapter 21 the last chapter in Judges deals with the problem of finding wives for these 600 men, because the rest of the nation of Israel laments the fact that on this day they said, why should there be one tribe lacking in Israel? God has taken and erased one tribe from our 12 from us, because now we've only got 600 men from Benjamin left, and we've all taken an oath that none of us will give our daughters to any of them. That means they're going to have to remain single the rest of their life. That means they'll produce no children. That means when they die, the tribe of Benjamin dies with them. So this is the dilemma that they are in chapter 21. They've got two solutions to get out of it. First of all, they go to the city of Jabesh-Gilead, which again is over now on the eastern side of the Jordan River. They got two solutions here to solve the problem of 600 unmarried Benjamites. First of all, they go and take 400 daughters, virgins, from the Jabesh-Gileadites, verse 8. Why did they go and take them? Because this was the city, the only city that didn't send anyone to war, didn't send any representatives to fight against Benjamin. And all the people that had been sent and all the people that went to fight had taken an oath together before the Lord, saying, we'll not give any of our daughters to these men. These men that survived here will not give our daughters to them. But they found a city here, Jabesh-Gilead, who didn't send anyone to fight, and therefore they go and destroy those people, destroy men, women, and children, and save only the virgins. And they end up with 400. Well, that still leaves us with 200. Jealous and unhappy Benjamites. So in verse 21, they take 200 more Israelites from a certain feast that they're holding in Shiloh. That's in verse 21. They don't tell us here who these people are. We know they're Israelites. They have to be Israelites. But they don't tell us who they are or what's going on, except that there's a feast here where all the women dance. And they told the Benjamites, you 200 men that don't have wives yet, hide in the bushes, hide in the vineyards. Whenever you see them dancing, then spot the one you like and go grab her. That's what they say. Whatever strikes your fancy, she's yours, take her. And they said, and if her father and her brethren come and complain to us, we'll just tell them to shut up. So there again, you end up with, terrible circumstances here in Israel at this time. Verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Which concludes our study in Judges. That's another problem that we've got there. Not a problem passage, another problem with their morals. Evidently, we've got Levites before this, we know that we do, that have been marrying outside of what they should be marrying. Rather than other daughters of Levites, they're just marrying anyone they want to marry. Therefore, they'd marry someone from Judah. So you'd end up with a Levite of Judah, which is something that generally you're not going to end up with. They weren't forbidden now to marry people like that, but generally it was best to marry someone in the Levitical family. An ephod is a certain garment that the priest wore that went around his loins. And teraphim were miniature gods. They were little statues. That's what Rebekah took from Laban whenever she fled from Laban. She took the teraphim. Remember, hid them under the camel seat, and she sat on them and said, the custom of women is on me and I can't rise. They're called hearth gods. Any other questions? That's because they set them on the hearth near the fire. Hallelujah. You're awful quiet tonight. Praise God. Are you still back in chapter 18 or something? Supposed to be charismatic assembly here. Sounds like a Baptist church when you get quiet like that. And I hadn't said anything profound enough to cause you to think about it either. It reminds you of church if you get too quiet. Quiet as a church mouse. Hallelujah. If you're saved, then you're glad about it. But this is Sunday school teaching here, friends. That's right. You got to start with kindergarten. This is kindergarten, Old Testament introduction. I mean, all you got to do is just know the whole Old Testament. But in your other things, you got to put some more thought in behind these things. And I imagine we'll hear a lot of wheels turning when we get to things like that. I guess that's right. You didn't have any Sunday school. I learned these things in Sunday school, and I didn't learn all this in Sunday school. I didn't learn a lot of this in Sunday school, but I mean, yeah, I guess so. But that was Presbyterian. That wasn't even Baptist Sunday school, but we studied all those things, and we had to know them. We had tests on them and everything. I remember all that. So I guess in a roundabout way, it was a blessing, but I would never justify Sunday school with the fact that I learned one or two things about Samson and Delilah, though. Do you have a question, brother?
Well, I guess what I was sitting